Hello, everyone. We are back again for our second video talking about church growth. Um, a quick background, about 6 or 7 years ago, my dad started going to a new church that had been growing by leaps and bounds in our community, and I noticed simultaneously my church had been shrinking in size, and through a little research, found out most of the churches in my community were shrinking. When I started asking about this and diving into it, I noticed there was a lot of emotion that was involved in talking to other people about this topic. So we decided to put out a series of videos talking about these issues as we see them. Talking today, we're going to talk about the data of churches shrinking and have those discussions with the hopes that people will listen to this possibly and take a moment to listen, to try to understand, to think about the situation that the church finds itself in today. And with me as always is my father, Dave Johnson. Dave, if you can quick say hi.
Hello to everybody.
Yep, make sure that everything's on. So we'll go ahead and start with our PowerPoint slide, which acts as a guide for us, but we'll also hopefully have some information for all of you. There's our title, Church Growth Discussion Videos, because what else would we call it? The first diagram we wanted to share today is pulled directly from, and I want to get this right, the ELCA data, or ELCA Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. And this diagram shows from 2017 to 2041 the forecasted shrinkage in church attendance. As a little background, most churches now and most of the church literature talks about how membership is not usually something analyzed because churches can have, 1,200 members of a church and you only have 150 that are actually showing up. So the literature talks about the attenders or attendance being what you should monitor as far as church growth goes, and that's the leading indicator of kind of the health of the church. So in 2017, the ELCA published this that based on their research in 2017, you had about 900,899 attenders that were coming. And then in 2025, we had that shrank by a very substantial margin to 604,000. So we lost about 300,000 people that had been attending. And they've forecasted out to 2041. And I think this is the jaw dropper, is we see it shrinks down to 15,811. In an earlier discussion, I had said, can you imagine if you go to a town that has 600,000 people or almost 500,000 people, and then all of a sudden you go there a few years later, 10 years later, and there's only 15,000 people? That's that type of shrinkage would just blow your mind. You'd say this town is dead then at that point. So, Dave, any thoughts when you see this projection again from the ELCA Office of Planning and Research?
I think what's most interesting, Bruce, as we've talked too, is that this is not from just some external source where you may question the data. When this is coming directly from the head Lutheran church office in the country, forecasting down to that level of 15,000, it's just astonishing to me, the numbers dropping, and that you don't hear more about this issue in local churches around as to how they're reacting or should or could be reacting to it. Because again, it comes right from, if you will, the horse's mouth of forecasting. So yeah, it's beyond, as we've discussed, it's beyond comprehension almost. And just to jump ahead just a little bit, you talked about the city of 600,000 going down to 15,000. One of those churches in the Lutheran church that was at least part of the ELCA was almost that same 16,000. So it would be like taking that large metropolitan city, which had a little suburb out there of 16,000, and saying, I guess that one survives because it's always done well, but everything else in the whole metropolitan area will be shut down and closed. And
In your,
go
I
ahead.
put up on the screen here, the church you're talking about is the Lutheran Church of Hope in Des Moines, Iowa, that during COVID, they had around 10,000 people and now are sitting about 15,000. And it was one of the fastest growing churches in the ELCA. Subsequently, this summer 2024, they decided to leave the ELCA. And I had, well, we'll talk about that later, but when I had heard that, I thought, well, I would assume the ELCA probably needed them more than they needed the ELCA. And we'll talk a little bit about that issue. So on this next slide we have here, Dave, you had done some number crunching to figure out what does this mean because both of us in discussions that we've had with others, I would say laity, folks that aren't researching this stuff. We've talked to them and we both find that it is a challenge because there doesn't seem to be a comprehension or an understanding. So here you plugged in some numbers to figure out what does all this mean and what would that shrinkage look like? And in 2017, I see you had it around that 899,000, and that was split among 8,724 churches. When you divide that out, you found that the average attendance of a church in the LCA would be about 103 people. Is that sound
That's
right?
that's correct.
Okay. So when we fast forward to 2025, there was a decrease of about 224. So in 2025, the ELCA has about 8,500 churches. So 224 closed. And when you split that out among the 604 attenders, excuse me, 604,000 attenders, you average about 71. So what you're saying is from 2017 to 2025, the ELCA has already lost more than 30% of those people that used to come to the church. Is that correct?
That's correct. I just add, Bruce, the number of churches from 8724 is an actual number. I'm not sure the 8,500 is actual versus an estimate based on what I would expect the attendance would have dropped, where they showed the 899,000 or 103 people in church in attendance. That 70 or the 8,500 may be an estimate as
Okay.
opposed to actual.
And that estimate might actually be higher than what it really is.
Very true.
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
true.
It's not to me looking at the future data, that might seem to be a high number, but neither here
Yeah.
nor there.
If you take the 899,000, which is their number, and drop it to 604,000, a 30% drop plus, I would expect the 8724 churches to have dropped more than down to 8,500, just given
Yeah.
the attendance drop. So yes, you're correct.
Okay, so, but for a layperson to understand this and to try to help them with the numbers, you have a church that, let's say, has 103 people in it. You fast forward from 2017 to 2025, now you're down to 71 people if you split this out among the churches. Again, this is to help people understand where we were at and what this will look like. Now, you fast forwarded it out to 2041. Um, this is again the ELCA's Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. In 2041, they've dropped this down and they say there's going to be 15,811 attenders based on our current trajectory. So in 2033, that would mean you would go down to about 300,000 attenders. So in 2033, which really isn't that far away, from going from in 2017 103 people, you're down to 35 in 2033. Then when you take it out to 2041, now you're down to two people at each of those 8,500 churches. The point being, I Googled this last night. It takes about 50 to 100 people to sustain a church, financially speaking. Now, I'm sure you could say, well, what if you have somebody that's really rich and they're paying for everything? Fine, but as an average, it takes about 50 to 100. So you can see here that this is alarming. This is not suggesting you have 20 or 30 years to start making changes. This is probably happening in the next 10 years where you become unsustainable. Thoughts on that one?
Yeah, we had shown there at maintaining the 8,500 churches and getting all the way down to two people, which is, sort of silly in some ways, but it does show the dramatic drop um, that if all churches tried to sustain. And then we'll go in a minute here to how many will close otherwise based on those numbers. And those numbers in attendance, as you noted, Bruce, are per the ELCA statistics and data. It is not just some far-fetched. This is the head agency of the Lutheran Church in the country predicting down to 16,000 people only, which means in the coming between now and that 16 years from now, that dramatic drop in numbers of attendees that they're estimating will cause numerous churches, which we'll get to in a sec, numerous churches to be closing anytime in the immediate few years. It's not going to wait until 2041 and everybody has 16 years, so to speak, because this is what you see is there's only going to be two people in a church by then. So the reduction has already started in churches, the closures of them, and it will expedite in the coming years based on the data from the parent organization, the ELCA.
Another way to look at this, I just ran the numbers on this. If the average church in the LCA has 75 people, let's just say, based on that number going down to 15,811, if an average church has 75 people, what that means is you're going to go from today 8,500 churches to in 2041, I just calculated 215 churches. Now, to me, that tells me then the lion's share of these churches are not going to be here. They will close down, they will go away. And that's only in 15 years. That's so again, the chance the what we might use this data to predict is in the next 8 to 10 years is when a church would start becoming unsustainable and unable to function because you don't have enough people because you're not growing. Does that, what do you think of that thought?
I think that's true, Bruce. And if you flip, I think, to the next one and you look at the church closures um, based on what you just said, etc., I think
It's
it's
lower.
yeah. If you look at again the churches, you're talking about closures from the 8,500 that by now even, and I think this was to sustain at about 100 per church, 2,500 almost by now, 3,000 closing by 2033 or only 8 years from now, 3,000 more. And by the next 8 years after that, another 2,800. So you're down to very few open, or you could make the argument that it was that one church in Des Moines is the only one open. And
Yeah,
again, I think what's most astonishing is that this data comes not from consultants and researchers and people out and wherever. This comes from the head organization of the Lutheran Church in America itself. Uh, and it's not suggesting by this data that you have until 2033 or even 2041 where their numbers project out. It's happening today and it's going to be happening tomorrow and next year and the year after in significant numbers for which this comes again, their data. People do not seem to be reacting to what the parent corporate, if you will, organization is telling them, telling
yeah.
us.
I think that is an issue is you have, and again, through some of the discussions I've had with folks, they don't understand this. That I think many people, maybe even most, when they look at data, their eyes glaze over because it's like, how do you read this? How do you understand this? The one thing that we can deduce, the one thing that the ELCA Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation is saying, this is not going in the right direction, and this is alarming. This is not something that, again, as well, 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years off. We're talking within the next decade. You're going to have very serious decline and closure. In the last video, we talked about this idea of a church death spiral, which is a common term that's used in the church consulting arena, where when a church dies, today it can feel like things are operating okay and we're doing fine. And then if this is a church that only has 100 or 200 people in it, all of a sudden you can go from, okay, you're functioning, to whoops, the wrong 10 or 20 people died this year, to now you just lost one position. And then losing that one person, that one ministry leader or pastor, well, then what are you going to do to get more people back in? And then you lose another and another, and all of a sudden it turns into a spiral where it gets down to the end and it happens extremely quick and very unexpected for most congregational members or attenders. It happens much, much faster than what one might expect.
I think that's a spiral effect, as you say.
Yeah,
And looking back on some of that data, by 2041, which is out there a ways, if you have 100 roughly, I think I said 120 by 2041, that's only 158 churches left open by then with 100 people. Um, which probably isn't enough in most cases, or you'll find some with two or 300 maybe, and some with 50. So, but 158 churches left out of 8,500. I
yeah,
mean, that tells you they're not all going to stay open until that period because the decline,
yes,
which is rapid, is going to start. We're in that spiral now. We
yeah,
have to be, per their numbers, already closing significant numbers right in 2025 and in the coming years.
yeah,
8,500 are not going to wait and drop to 158 17 years from now. So
yeah.
it's
It's
the
it's
spiral
happening. We're in
is
it.
happening. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that gets into the question, are all churches facing this, or all religions facing this same phenomenon of decline, of not attending, not participating? And you did some research on this from before, correct?
Yes, I read some articles and do the Google kind of thing, but got hard data on United Church of Christ, on the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, Southern Baptist, Catholic churches, etc. Just out of curiosity to see what data said for their numbers in those different denominations. They are all in a state of decline, some a little more than others, but some 40 and 50%. Looking at the United Church of Christ between 1957 and 2017, the congregations declined 40 plus percent and members declined 61%. And most of those churches, I think it was over half, actually had from 1 to 50 people in them, which
Yeah.
is almost not sustainable. So, yes, the numbers at primarily denominational churches, which is another whole discussion, kind
Yeah.
of, but primarily denominational churches are declining in virtually every one of them, just as the Lutheran Church is and as it's projected.
The slide here we kind of skipped over looked at the Mormon, Protestant, Islam, Catholic, Jewish, Orthodox, Buddhist, Hindu, so on and so forth. And you see that it looks like the participation rate for all of them seems to be going down. Simultaneously, what I think is interesting is there are some researchers out there, I think it's John Vervaeke, who calls this the meaning crisis, where we find in colleges you have young people that they're hurting, they're screaming for meaning in their life. And it's interesting because it's like you have these two things happening at the same time, and it's hard to say one isn't causing the other. It's totally uncorrelated. Clearly, it's correlated in some way. So, um, I wanted to touch. So, as you said, the Episcopal Presbyterian United Church of Christ has lost us a tremendous amount, more than 40%. United Methodist recently had a mass disaffiliation because of their policies and governance issues. And even after that, it still has dropped. Attendance has dropped by another 20%. Southern Baptist probably fared better than anyone, but they're not unaffected. They're still seeing a very, very similar trend and have lost a great number. And that kind of gets us into some of the questions and some of the issues. So, just as some quick highlights before we uh, end here. One that we noticed was in the ELCA, one of the fastest growing churches they had was the Lutheran Church of Hope in Des Moines, Iowa, who had 7 campuses, again, had 10 to 15,000 attenders, not members, attenders every week. And in 2024, they voted to leave the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. So they decided to leave. Thoughts on that, Dave?
Well, it's interesting as we go back to those other graphs previously, where by 2041 they projected the ELCA to be down to 15,000 people attending. And here was the one church that's been climbing since COVID and was even higher before COVID. And they're in the 15,000 area. So it's like that one church
It
was
was
the
like
one.
they're it. They were left.
They're it. They're
Yeah.
the only one that's going to be out there. But I do think it raises a question that you'll touch on more, Bruce, on the issue of denominations and why they pulled out and how our churches in the future, under all of these denominations, which are shrinking, and when you look at those that are growing, and some are, those apparently are tend to be on the non-denominational side, even though I believe you indicated, Bruce, to me that many of those were previously denomination churches that
Yep.
are now have changed and have dropped. And so that's a whole nother question of what's the denominational influence or aspect,
Issue. Yeah.
an issue related to closures or staying operational.
And I had seen that many circumstances of that, and I talked to one of the staff members at our South Dakota Synod office and mentioned that this had happened. They said that's very common now. You're seeing these growing churches, especially mega churches, once they get to that 2,000 mark, they try to stop affiliating with the Southern Baptist Convention, the Methodists, the Lutheran. They go so far as to take it out of their name. And what the staff member told me is some of them keep their affiliation with the denomination. Some of them do drop it completely and say we're done. We're not affiliated anymore. And I know a lot of people when they hear that will try to bring up the issue of LGBTQ acceptance into the church and some of that. But what you also notice with these mega churches is many of them are obfuscating that issue. They're either not talking about it or they're leaving it unresolved. And I'm like, well, wait a minute then. That that tells you then something completely different than what most of us would deduce, wouldn't it?
Yes, and I think as we've talked before, the issue of young people that every church needs to stay
Yeah.
operational. Those young people are looking for a deeper spiritual relationship. They're looking for a church that teaches and helps them to live as a good Christian in today's society, etc. And some of these other issues that denominations are quarreling over, et cetera, just are not of interest. And in my thinking, the denominational churches that have continued to be structured and looked to those aspects of life as the future will continue to slide because young people who are craving for meaning in their life as a Christian, etc., just aren't interested in that.
Yeah.
And I think it will beg the question for every in particular denominational church to examine what they're going to do about what people like the ELCA are saying of just diving down into nothing. What are they going to do to stay relevant, to bring new, younger people in, to grow again, etc.? And at least in the Lutheran world, it seems there hasn't been a whole lot of activity or action that I'm aware of that has seemed to changing that. And in the meantime, the numbers are just continuing to dive, according to ELCA, with no activity to reverse the situation. But it's not that there aren't young people out there
Yeah.
wanting a better life, wanting a better spiritual, in-depth life for themselves and their families and their friends, etc. But they're finding it in different places and I don't think that's wrong in different places. These are good churches. They're mega churches. They're growing, they're teaching, but they're doing things that make the younger person feel welcome in that setting and with other young people. And I think the denominational church world is a very serious issue that they're facing right now. and
You know,
I just don't seem to be aware of it.
they I wanted to make note because I'm sure some folks would challenge the thought that I raised there about the churches not taking on social issues. I will challenge anyone and everyone. Go research the growing churches that you can find in and around your community, in larger urban areas, et cetera, et cetera. Go research them and see if they are making this social justice issue the forefront of what they're trying to communicate with others. And I can promise you, you're going to find they don't. That it's most of their intent in there, what they're trying to drive is not focusing on that. And I think that I know for a younger, being a little younger, younger than you anyway, to me, that's refreshing. It
Yeah.
is refreshing. It's like let's stop talking about all that divides us and let's start talking about kind of what unites us. And that is this belief in Christ and living to emulate Christ and figure out who is this person even. And I think in our next videos we'll really explore, okay, based on what we're seeing, what trends of these growing churches, how do we communicate to folks that have not seen this so they understand the changes that need to be made in their own church? Any last thoughts before we end this video?
No, not too much. I think the data is extremely interesting and is the springboard to what now. I think the more difficult issue that we've got to discuss and research some more is, so what does a small church especially do with this situation that they're facing? Another issue we've talked about a little bit, I trust that we said we'd try and jump at some point, is the issue of a church as a business. And we don't want to get into that now. And I don't even, there's things one can argue about business issues, uh, which is not the issue, but trying to look at what we all have interest in, which is the church we attend and what's happening and how do we reverse these things and how are we monitoring and what we're doing will take us into some discussion about where we at and where are we going and how are we going to right this ship. But I would agree with you, Bruce, that the couple things I've read, especially lately, are churches need to have a much more external view of what they're doing versus the internal with the focus on us. It must be an external view. And the other is really getting into being a discipleship church of teaching, of bringing people deeper into their faith,
Yeah,
deeper into their lives of being a disciple, being a Christ follower and emulating him. And I think those will be interesting discussions as to how that can be done, et cetera, too.
yeah. If you want to fast forward through that to the end of these video series, that seems to be the answer is it's discipleship. Um, which we also need to talk about in a video of if you grew up in a church that never did that and you've never experienced that and you've never seen that, well, how do you handle it? So that'll be a video for another day. I'll leave you again. This is from the ELCA Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. Again from a 2041 estimate to go from 604,000 today down to 15,000 in essence is saying you're going to have about 8,000, 8,200 churches that are closing. And folks, that's going to be, there's a good chance that's going to be your church that will be closing. The other thing I would say to that is we have folks that look at that and say, well, what they want when they're going to the church is that tradition in their tradition. And when you said externally focused, tradition is fine, but you have to understand if others don't want those traditions and they're not going to come into that tradition, then you don't have to change. That's fine. But then you go away. That's what happens in that formula is you either have to become externally focused and look at what brings people in, or you as a church go away and then your traditions are dead. They're gone. They're not to be resurrected, and at least by you or that church. So any other last thoughts on that one?
Just a quick one, Bruce. As people may, listening to this, may say, "What does that old guy and his kid know about this stuff?" And not sure they believe it, understand it, or whatever. I just reference back to, especially in the Lutheran faith, reference back. Then check with the ELCA.
Yeah.
As a Lutheran, just check with them and ask them the question of
Yep.
how have they concluded. So this isn't just old guy Dave and a son. This is coming from the ELCA. And when they have projected that number, then the question from the Lutherans in particular, but really all people in denominational churches in particular, which are going down and being reduced, go check with your
Yeah.
higher headquarters people
Yep.
because they're the ones who are making these projections. We're just sharing them.
Yeah. Again, these weren't pulled from like Tufts University or something. These were
Right,
pulled from those denominations, those
right,
headquarter elements of those denominations.
right.
You are so right. And that's probably a good place to leave it off of. This is not us. This is not
Right.
our data. We're just sharing the actual synod or the actual organization's data that they put out. So
Yep.
why don't we go ahead and stop so this doesn't get too long? Should we close with a
Good.
quick prayer?
Go ahead.
God, thank you for helping us and helping us to learn this information. We hope to always do your will and not do our will. Um, and sometimes when we don't know what that is, that just means we have to keep an open mind. We need to keep an open mind into everything we see and explore to again find it what it is you want. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Yep. We will see you folks the next time around. We'll try to get hopefully a few more videos out. So have a good day.
That was good.